So we're really humbled. Thank you again. The Gardner Center is really humbled to be part of such a great cohort of scholars and leaders and practitioners who've come before us to talk a lot about the issues regarding poverty, inequality, and education. So today, I'll be talking a little bit about our project called the College Readiness Indicator Systems Initiative, affectionately known as CRIS. So I'll start the presentation by giving you just a little bit of background information about the initiative, how it came about, give you some context on why the work is quite important, and then talk a little bit about some of the implementation lessons that we've learned. CRIS was actually implemented in multiple sites across the country, and the Gardner Center, one of our sort of main roles is to sort of document what happened in that implementation and the sort of tracking and identifying the facilitating and hindering conditions by which CRIS either flourished or floundered. I'm happy to answer any clarifying questions along the way, and hopefully we can engage in a good Q&A afterwards. So the CRIS project was a 3-year project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we worked very closely in collaboration with 2 other partners, the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University and the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. So these 3 institutions together worked with various sites across the country to co-develop a college readiness indicator system and to sort of, again, study the implementation process. So each organization played slightly different roles, but I just want to make sure to acknowledge them and also acknowledge all the folks before me, some of whom are in the audience. So I joined the Gardner Center and started on this project at the tail end. This is a 3-year project. So I joined at the end of around the 3rd year mark. So there were lots and lots of folks prior to me who've done a lot of great work, including our fearless faculty leaders, Milbree McLaughlin and Ed Hartle, as well as my colleagues at the Gardner Center, and a great cohort of graduate students who helped with literature review, data collection, analysis, and numerous other tasks. So what is college readiness? So the CRIS work really is sort of situated in this, in the literature, in the sense that we know that more and more kids are applying to go to college, and there's definitely a college for all ethos in most American public schools, but many are continuing to arrive in college sort of underprepared and unprepared to successfully pursue post-secondary opportunities. So the issue of remediation, for example, is a big issue that a lot of community colleges are dealing with, a lot of state public institutions are dealing with. And the issue of remediation has a lot of implications in students' time to degree and the amount of resources that these colleges are expending. So some estimate that about only 1/3 of high school graduates possess the minimum qualifications that it takes to successfully pursue a college degree. And so as a result, a lot of folks are ending up in developmental courses. So with guidance from the Gates Foundation, so for the CRIS project, we adopted a definition by David Conley from the University of Oregon, who's really been arguing for a long time that students not only need the academic preparation in order to succeed in post-secondary level work, but they also need the habits of mind, as he coins it, the attitudes, the attributes, and the college knowledge also necessary to succeed. So the way that we're defining it here in the CRIS context is college readiness is the level of preparation a student needs in order to enroll and succeed without remediation. And I think that's a really important part of the definition. In a credit-bearing general education course at a post-secondary level institution. So meaning that you can succeed in these courses without needing developmental supports and being able to succeed so that you can take the next level or the next sequence in the course offerings. So, and here when we say post-secondary institution, we mean both a 2-year and a 4-year college. So that's a little bit of background about how we're even defining college readiness. So what is a CRIS? So it's a what, not a who. So CRIS is a system. I think that's the most sort of important word about the CRIS initials, because it's a system of indicators that tracks students' progress academically, but also tries to understand the extent to which they understand navigating college and all sorts of things, and all sorts of things that are required in order to navigate college well. So do you know how to fill out a FAFSA form, do you know what the deadlines are, how do you seek supports while you're there. And the CRIS also measures academic tenacity, and I'll get into these dimensions a little bit more in later slides. So CRIS also allows for the early identifications of students that are needing more supports in order to finish high school and graduate high school ready for college and post-secondary opportunities. So the CRIS system goes beyond early warning indicators that Prudence mentioned earlier, because in many ways, early warning indicators are good systems to track students' progress towards high school graduation. But the CRIS system is about another system. It's about the higher education system. So we sort of go beyond that and try to identify the kids, not only for their ability to graduate and their readiness to graduate high school, but then move on to post-secondary opportunities. And we do this at 3 different levels, both at the individual setting and system level. And I'll explain those again in detail later slides. So here's where CRIS took place. Again, it was a 3-year implementation study that took place in 5 sites, large urban sites across the country, here in San Jose Unified School District, in Dallas Independent School District, Pittsburgh Public Schools, School District of Philadelphia, and the New Visions for Public Schools, which is an intermediary organization that works with the New York State Department of Ed and a number of public schools within New York City. They provide sort of support and guidance with a lot of emphasis on using data, and they have a very strong focus on college readiness. So actually all of the sites, except for School District of Philadelphia, participated in our implementation study. School District of Philadelphia had the least amount of participation for a variety of reasons. So when I talk about the lessons learned about CRIS, it's really about the other sites more than Philadelphia. So these locations were picked by the Gates Foundation based on a few factors. They already were known and had some form of indicator system already in place. So like an early warning indicator system to track students' progress towards high school graduation. The sites also represented geographical diversity, demographic diversity in the students that they served. And then in the case of New Visions, it's a different kind of a model, right? It's an intermediary organization that works with a network of schools. So it was an opportunity for the Gates Foundation to study how would a CRIS system actually take place in such a setting or that context. So that's why these districts were chosen, or these sites. So the CRIS has 4 parts. A College Readiness Indicator System has 4 parts. The first, the framework is sort of defined, again, by trying to understand students, not only their academic preparedness, but also their college knowledge and academic tenacity. It's, again, focused on 3 different levels: at the student level, at the individual or student level, at the system level, which is at the classroom or the, at the setting level, which is the classroom or the school level, and then at the system level, which is more of the district and the community and beyond. In terms of tools that make up the CRIS framework, it includes a menu of indicators with each of those content dimensions. And these indicators have been shown to be valid and reliable indicators for success, both in high school and in college, and I'll get to those in a second. And then in terms of another tool, we developed a cycle of inquiry tool, which we kind of call the engine. It's the engine that drives the whole thing. It gives a framework for schools and personnel to sort of look at data in a systematic way, to look at the kids and flag the kids that are in need of supports, and then to be able to have a structure and a system where they can regularly look at data and to make sure that they can course correct if the supports are not working for particular students. And it also allows the system to think about how to assess those types of supports. Bye, baby. So let's talk a little bit about these 3 dimensions. So the 3 content dimensions are academic preparedness, college knowledge, and academic tenacity. So we're arguing, and Conley has argued this for many years, that these dimensions help paint a much more sort of comprehensive picture of what it takes to be ready in college. Most early warning indicator systems have really just focused on academic preparedness, sort of largely overlooking the other 2 dimensions that have arguably been very important in the way that students are able to succeed in post-secondary education. So for academic preparedness, we're talking about, the usual suspects, right? Coursework, the skills, the achievement needed to succeed at college level work. So these indicators include GPA, test scores, SAT scores, et cetera, students' participation in advanced level courses. For college knowledge, we're sort of looking at those indicators that can kind of, answer those questions like, does the student actually have access to information about college opportunities in their neighborhood or in their town? Do they know about the FAFSA? Do they know the important deadlines? Do they have the sort of networks and social support and information and social capital sort of necessary in order to navigate that very complicated system in many ways for a lot of students, particularly first-generation students who don't have those types of supports at home. So we're looking at those indicators as well under the college knowledge dimension. And then finally, academic tenacity, which I think is the sort of most elusive of all three of these dimensions, are the beliefs and motivation, attitudes, right, the attributes needed to successfully succeed, right? Do you have the self-discipline? Do you have self-efficacy? Do you have the ability to look at your learning as opportunities your failures as opportunities to learn and not necessarily as setbacks? So I think these are also important. A lot of folks here in Stanford are doing work in this field, and so I defer to them, obviously, for their extensive research on academic tenacity. But I would say within the CRIS framework, it was probably the most elusive and most difficult to track among the districts that we were working with. So again, CRIS examines college readiness at the individual or the student level. So when you take those dimensions of academic preparedness, college knowledge, academic tenacity, we're looking at indicators at 3 different levels for all of them. So we're looking at indicators at the student level, we're looking at indicators at the classroom or school setting level, and at the system level, the district, the surrounding community, the influence of local and state policies. So it's really important, I think, for us to sort of reiterate that when we talk about indicators, things like race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status are very important indicators when you talk about post-secondary success. But in this framework, we're talking about those indicators that are actionable, the ones that you can actually have some sort of effect on. So things like attendance, maybe then you can help implement supports in order to help improve students' ability to attend school more regularly. So sort of keeping that in mind, because we are aware that there are a lot of others indicators that may not be necessarily within the purview of control for most of these school districts. So the 3 dimensions and the 3 levels yield a 3x3 matrix that we call a sample menu, a menu of indicators for CRIS. And we sort of use the menu intentionally because it's like a menu in a restaurant. We don't expect every district to pick every single indicator to track at every single level. So we envision that the district partners that we were working with to choose particular indicators that they were already tracking. A lot of these, like I said earlier, these districts and these partners have already been tracking a lot of these indicators. We weren't asking them necessarily to then monitor a bunch of whole other indicators that they weren't not really keeping data on. But in fact, we were just trying to get them to pick even just one within each of these dimensions at each of these levels. So in terms of academic preparedness, and as an example, you have the usual suspects, like I said, GPA test scores, participation in AP or IB courses as an indicator for academic preparedness. So that's at the student level. And then at the setting level, oftentimes these are aggregate measures of the individual level indicators. So you can aggregate the sort of classroom GPAs or the school level GPAs of that particular setting. But there are also these sort of standalone setting level indicators that kind of get at, well, what are the conditions in the classroom? What's the culture like in the school? So when you look at college knowledge, for example, we're arguing in the CRIS framework that it's also important to have a college-going climate within your high school, right? So when we did a lot of the site visits in Dallas, for example, we visited a school. It was a Friday, and all the teachers wore their sweatshirts from their universities. And each classroom was named a particular college. And they had a really strong college-going culture in that school. They always asked students where they were going to go to college, et cetera, on a regular basis. So we're sort of, at the setting level, we're trying to figure out, are the conditions in place to promote this sort of sense of college readiness? And then at the system level, this is mostly happening at the district level and beyond. To what extent is the district supporting and providing enough resources to be able to promote those conditions happening at the classroom and at the school levels? What kind of professional development are they allocating to the schools in terms of data use practices? To what extent is the district partnering with communities, community-based organizations like United Way, for example, to help create this sort of college-going culture or this sort of emphasis on going to college? So I think for the CRIS framework, what's unique about it is it goes beyond focusing on the kid and the indicators that we usually focus on, but rather we're thinking about other important dimensions that are important for the success overall, both at the settings and context in which they're embedded. So we sort of want to emphasize that if you're serious about college readiness, you really have to think about how is the system actually supporting the students and the folks in that system and in that setting to have this kind of college-going culture. As a tool, I mentioned earlier, the CRIS has a cycle of inquiry tool, and it really sort of helps to slow the process down a little bit. It not forces, but it's a way to get the school and the district leaders to think about how are these indicators actually then being used to be tied to supports and interventions for students. Because indicators by themselves don't necessarily imply a particular set of action. They don't exist in a vacuum. So in order to actually have these indicators be useful, they have to be actionable and be linked to particular supports. So the cycle of inquiry tool is really just sort of a process it slows everything down, right? And it sort of articulates who's in charge, how are we identifying the kids that are in need of supports, who are the most at risk. It allows the school or the district to plan what are the resources that are available to actually help these students, how then to implement the supports throughout the year, so making sure that students are connected to particular interventions like tutoring or different types of other learning supports, who's monitoring their progress, right? So who's in charge of making sure that Manuelito is attending school more regularly? Are we doing home visits for his family, et cetera? And then whether or not those supports are actually working, how the cycle of inquiry sort of helps, and it affords an opportunity to then look at the data to then say, maybe we need a bit more support. Maybe Manuelito's parents need mental health counseling, or there was an issue with, I don't know, food aid, for example, is a really important one in my work in Redwood City. So the cycle of inquiry just helps them to systematically think through this process, to analyze the results, and then to plan in future how to then continue working with these students that are at risk, and also to analyze the results to see how well those interventions actually worked, so that when you get a new cohort of kids, you have some sort of experience in the data to support the extent to which those supports were actually efficacious or effective. So we call it, the cycle of inquiry is like the engine that kind of runs the system, because without it, it's just a bunch of indicators, right? And we know that context matters. So we know that the cycle of inquiry, the tracking of these indicators, the use of data, the ability of school personnel to get together on a regular basis to look at data at the school site, all happens within a particular context. The extent to which students are having knowledge about college opportunities, college match is a really important issue, they all happen within a particular context where there are factors that are happening in the community and in local policy contexts and state contexts that sort of, influence the extent to which kids are better prepared or have the knowledge necessary. So these include, for example, like policies around high school graduation requirements. Is college affordable to a lot of the families in the community? What kind of supports exist in the community to help students get the access to the information that they need around college? Is that community particularly good at collaborating with other community-based organizations around college? So we know that the extent to which students are excelling or progressing in these domains all happen within a context. And the process by which we track these indicators and act on these indicators are also happening within a particular context. And that was really, really clear in those different sites that we worked with, because Dallas looked very different from San Jose, and San Jose looked very different from New York, et cetera. So that's a lot. And we tried our best to put together all of it in one fancy framework. So when you read this from left to right, you have the dimensions that I mentioned earlier, the academic preparedness, tenacity, college knowledge. We're looking at those key content dimensions at 3 different levels at the individual setting and system, and that we are engaging in this cycle of inquiry to be able to track these indicators and act on them for the purpose of getting students better ready and prepared for college. So we often call this the Uber framework, because it's sort of like is everything. Someone at the Gates Foundation got a lot of money to create this. So, and then over there on the very far left is take stock and prioritize. And here we're sort of, at the beginning of the school year, it's an opportunity for the district or for the school to really understand who are the cohorts of kids that are incoming, what kinds of information do we have about them. A lot of the schools, for example, in Dallas, they were set up in strategic feeder patterns. So the elementary schools were talking very regularly with the middle schools, and then the middle schools were talking regularly with the high schools. So they had an opportunity within Dallas, a structured opportunity to sort of take stock, prioritize who are their kids, what kind of supports will they need, what kind of resources do we even have to provide these students supports, et cetera. So this is the overall CRIS framework. And we studied it, and we studied this process over 3 years with those sites. And in the next few slides, I'm going to sort of talk about, we did some observations. We had phone calls with them every couple weeks or every month. We interviewed them at various periods. We did focus groups. We analyzed documents around their college readiness efforts. And they were all at different places, right? So some places were much more ready to take on this very sort of systematic kind of reform, while others were not. And in the 3 years that we were following them, and I came in at the very end, a lot of the districts had gone through some significant changes, including a lot of their superintendents had changed, and then so you get a new superintendent, and then they reorganize at the district level. And so all the work that had been happening on CRIS then had to sort of not necessarily start back again, but it had to get reconfigured in different ways. So when we looked at the implementation of this, we sort of found common elements that we're calling essential in the implementation of a college readiness indicator system. And these are probably not that surprising, right? So it's important to engage leadership, to build a data infrastructure, to strengthen the capacity of the adults to use that data, to make sure that indicators are actually linked to supports, and the sort of importance of developing partnerships with community-based organizations that are doing very similar work. And without a doubt, each site approached the CRIS project in very different ways. So each site had a CRIS team, and they were our liaisons within the district. They were made up of folks from different parts of the district, from research and evaluation to curriculum and instruction. Sometimes there were principals that were part of the CRIS team, but they changed over time given all the tumult that was happening. So I'm just going to go over these one at a time. So without, strong leadership commitment, a CRIS will just really kind of flounder, right, without this actual leadership that's needed at the top. CRIS really sort of helps to organize the system and organize the district's strategic plan to have an intentional focus on using data and a set of indicators to support college readiness. We found that leadership was really important to make sure that everyone had the same definition of college readiness, right? That we were sort of all working towards the same goals. And the importance of being able to then have a data infrastructure to then use and to exploit in order to have more informed decision-making that was actually based on evidence. So we found that without the leadership of high-level folks at the assistant superintendent level or the superintendent level, a lot of the work around CRIS really kind of just, it wouldn't take off as well. So we found an example in San Jose, and my colleague Graciela was assigned to San Jose. And what they did was, just like the other site, they formed a CRIS team that included senior staff from the data research and assessment, from curriculum and instruction. And that CRIS team came together to really think about how does CRIS actually align with their strategic plan that was already in place, Opportunity 21. And what they did was they looked at the key performance measures, that what they were calling KPMs, that they were already tracking in the district. So this included students' participation in AP courses. So San Jose were tracking students' participation in these advanced level courses and found that some students in some schools had, some students in some schools were exposed more than others to advanced level courses. Some students were not taking the AP exams for financial issues. And so I think what ended up happening is because they were able to come together, think about the key performance measures and see how it's sort of aligned with CRIS, they were already doing much of that work. But they used the cycle of inquiry to sort of make sure that they were keeping track of these measures. And through the CRIS team, they had a regular process by which they can come together and have a conversation about that. So we thought, and because the assistant superintendent was participating the entire time that the CRIS project was happening, that really helped to sort of build legitimacy for this process. So the second element is around building a data infrastructure. So there's different things around this. So there's like the technical aspects, right? So the server, what does it actually look like? How do I print out a report? The reporting features, the analytic tools. We found in Dallas, for example, in a lot of the interviews that I was a part of, the technical architecture of where data were housed was really a frustrating process. Getting the data from these systems was a very frustrating process for many teachers because they would say things like, well, these kinds of test scores are kept in this system, but then I have to go to this system in order to get their attendance. Then I have to go to this system to sort of see their disciplinary records. And those systems didn't talk to one another. So they were sort of looking at different systems. So there's an opportunity here to sort of create a sort of warehouse or a system that actually has that capability to then link these data across the different systems. And importantly, there needs to be the sort of organizational routines that identify the people in the organization that are responsible for looking at these data and acting on these data and assigning people to make sure that students' progress are being monitored through the use of these data. So there's these routines and practices using the cycle of inquiry that was really important when we talk about building the data infrastructure. And the third bullet is around formats and timelines. So another thing that came up repeatedly in our site visits and our interviews was that schools, many of the schools were data rich. There was a lot of data, but they didn't actually know how to read it, or they didn't really know how to make sense of like a gigantic Excel sheet that just tracks students' attendance. So the system wasn't formatted in a way where they could where it was user-friendly. The system didn't think about the user. And so as a result, the formats by which these data came actually had an influence to the extent to which they were using these data. And oftentimes, when they got the data, it was way too late. So they would say, oh, you know what I mean? Like the data weren't entered into the system in time for them to actually then provide that student with supports. So again, this is all about trying to understand, and we don't necessarily say there's an easy fix to this. These are three very distinct things, but it all sort of falls under this idea that it's really essential to have a strong data infrastructure, both from the technical and the organizational aspects of things, because otherwise, the end user is not actually using the data that you're keeping. And again, it just ends up being a lot of data, but not a lot of information. So datacation, I kind of like that name, was used by New Vision's public schools. And Milbury McLaughlin actually was the site leader for New Visions. And datacation was, I'm actually not too familiar, but from what I understand, it's a web-based school data management system. And it had sort of operational or analytic tools that were user-friendly. So the teachers were able to print out reports, and students actually could access the system as well as parents. So it was speaking to a whole host of different audiences. And so New Visions, using datacation, was able to then provide the schools in their network some technical supports around actually acting on these data as well. So again, New Visions is an interesting model because they're sort of an intermediary organization that works with a cohort or a network of schools, and their job and responsibility is to be able to leverage the data and to help use that data to inform curriculum and practices at the schools in their network. In many ways, CRIS is beyond the student, and it's about strengthening the capacity of the adults to actually do this work. You know, investing in the technical aspects and making sure that you have the servers to hold the data is one thing, but in order for you to actually make use of that, you need to invest in the adults in the classrooms and in the schools to use these data in ways that are actually meaningful and actionable. So one of the things that we saw that was really important was, for example, protecting the time that teachers and community providers and administrators at the school sites were meeting in order to talk about data. At the district level, it was also really important that curriculum and instruction were talking with research and accountability to try to understand how is it that we can exchange data and think about our practices in sort of a much more cohesive way. And one of the things that I thought was really powerful in some of the sites was by the sort of partnerships that these schools and districts establish with parents and with community-based organization to sort of support students' increased understanding of what it takes to go to college. A lot of the students in these districts are often our first-generation students that don't have the information or the experience. You know, maybe their parents didn't go to college, so they don't necessarily have the experience in order to, you know, fill out a FAFSA. I don't know. I tried to help my nephew recently, and it's kind of complicated even. So I think it's important that the schools sort of use the resources around them, because in many of these sites, like Dallas, for example, they have a lot of community-based organizations working around this issue of college knowledge. So speaking of Dallas, I mentioned this earlier. So Dallas is set up, Dallas is huge, right? It has, I think it has over 220, it has around 220 schools. I think there's 150,000 kids in the school district. And they're set up in ways where they were divided into strategic patterns. So the elementary schools that fed into particular middle schools would often talk with one another to sort of flag kids who are in need and who are vulnerable. And then those middle schools then would talk to the high schools. So they had this structure where they would get together to talk about students. And we observed those meetings, and it was a really interesting meeting because it was very scripted. So they had a protocol, and because their time was so limited, they had to very much efficiently run that meeting by just talking about certain things. So because they can talk about all sorts of other things, but it was really an opportunity, I think, which I haven't seen in a lot of districts, for this sort of interface with the feeders. So that if you're coming from an elementary school and you're coming to my middle school, that I understand where you're coming from, if you need particular supports, or if there's something about your family that I should know about, et cetera. I think this sort of structure allowed them to talk about it and then to use data as part of that conversation. So again, this is very similar, making sure that these indicators just don't exist in a vacuum, right? That they're actually tied to supports. And this was probably what was really tricky for a lot of our partners was, so you have a kid who might be struggling academically or isn't attending school on a regular basis. A lot of schools have these sort of blanket kinds of interventions. Let's put them into tutoring, or let's get them signed up for this or for that. And what we found was it was important to not only link the student with a support, but then to follow up, to make sure that the support is actually working, and then to make course corrections along the way. But for many of the schools, a lot of the schools that we followed, they didn't even know all the supports that were available at their school. Because they had such a large school, they had a lot of partnerships with community-based organizations like YMCA, Boys and Girls Club, tutoring services, faith-based organizations that were providing all types of supports. But sometimes they were established in the school because of a particular teacher who had a relationship with so-and-so. And then so they had a lot of these supports at school that they didn't even know, actually, that they had such extensive supports and interventions available. So I think, for this element, we thought that, again, by having these inquiry groups and using the cycle of inquiry as one tool to link indicators in a systematic way, then they're able to more have a regular conversation around those kids that are placed at risk. So again, San Jose had an OPSTAT team, so OP being Opportunity 21, which is their strategic plan, and STAT for statistics, data-driven. So they looked at, using this OPSTAT team, they looked at, again, I wish I had Graciela in the audience, but they looked at the data to examine what are the cut points and thresholds by which students would then sort of raise a flag in order to get a particular intervention. So another thing about these indicators like GPA or test scores or attendance, the ways in which a district would take these indicators and then establish cut points or thresholds varied. So in Pittsburgh, it was 2.5 or 2.75, and then in other places it would be a 3.0, where if a student fell below that particular threshold, that would signal an intervention to be employed. So in San Jose, they were able to look at the students' participation in these AP courses and then having a particular threshold by which these flags would be raised so that they can provide them with particular supports. And then finally, the last element, again, is establishing these partnerships, as I've mentioned several times. In many ways, a lot of these partnerships and these intermediary organizations can help the school sort of organize the school's efforts around getting kids more college ready. So you could work with the United Way, for example, to then maybe be the lead organization within the school or within the district to help make sure that supports in all of these dimensions are present in the school and are being implemented. So we saw an example in Pittsburgh where the district had an MOU agreement, Memorandum of Understanding agreement with the United Way, and through this Be a Middle School Mentor program. So through this program, the Pittsburgh Public Schools established partnerships where these middle school students would get a mentor to sort of support their sort of academic success overall. And these mentors are often those are in college or have been to college, so it was an opportunity for them to get the college knowledge that they would need to understand and how to navigate college and post-secondary opportunities. So just to sum up, tracking and evaluating supports and linking those supports to particular indicators was a real big challenge for a lot of our district partners. This project was only 3 years, and in many ways, a lot of the districts, like I said, experienced a lot of change and tumult. They changed superintendents, and then the new leadership regime came in, and then they had to change the central office. So I think 3 years was sort of just like a snapshot by which we can sort of observe this implementation process. So, but within those 3 years, we found some particular challenges around tracking and evaluating supports, using the cycle of inquiry, not just at the individual level, because the cycle of inquiry, you can have a cycle of inquiry looking at indicators at the individual level, but then you can also have a cycle of inquiry looking at indicators at the setting level or at the school level, and then at the system writ large. And the extent to which the district was able to provide technical support, professional development opportunities to the schools around data use and data to increase their data culture and practices, we found that to be really important as well. I think there's still, we don't know around what kinds of interventions from the district level are really good at increasing the school's use of data. So a lot in Dallas, they had data coaches. That, those are the people in charge that would be placed in schools, and they would be in charge to look at data. But they were just one person. So there are other types of interventions, but I think there's still a lot of research to be done around, and Julie Marsh is doing it at USC, like what kinds of interventions are actually the ones that are most meaningful, and does it depend on the type of data that you're tracking? So looking ahead, there are sort of opportunities for the CRIS project. We've developed this resource series that are available in our website, and I think with the onset of the Common Core standards, which really focuses on getting students more college ready, it's still very much focused at the individual level, right? But I think that what the CRIS framework can do, it can build on this focus on college readiness by thinking about indicators both at the setting and at the system level. And as more and more states are adopting longitudinal data tracking systems, I think there's an opportunity to use CRIS as a framework and the cycle of inquiry as a tool to track particular indicators using these data systems at particular levels. With the local control accountability plans, the LCAPs, schools are having to demonstrate and document how are they interacting with the community around supporting students, particularly parents and other community-based organizations. So again, CRIS really sort of stresses those partnerships with community-based organizations and others to make sure that college readiness remains a focus. And lastly, CORE is the California Office for Reform in Education. It's 9 districts. I think it's 9. It used to be, or 8. Nancy tells me it's 8. One of the 8 largest, one of the, some of the biggest districts in California that have come together to create a collaborative effort around an accountability system that also not just looks at academic preparedness kinds of indicators, but also the school, culture, climate, social, emotional learning, tenacity kinds of measures. So these districts have come together to understand, well, how can we keep track of those as well? Because we think parent engagement, social, emotional learning are also important to keep track of in addition to these other things. So I think the CRIS framework also can sort of help provide a structure for those districts that are part of CORE. So again, these are some of the resources that are available. I talked about the framework, the menu, and then the essential elements, and you can all get it at the website here. So that is all for me.
system level things, but I wonder how the system then responds to evidence that it's not providing the kind of opportunities
Right.
it intends to, at least by what it's measuring. Because I'm sure they didn't always, or maybe they did, but did they always measure up on all the system ones, and what did they do when they didn't measure up on the system indicators?
Well, I have to say, for a good portion of this, and Oded can sort of help me back this up, the first year was really just trying to figure out which indicator to track at the individual level. A lot of the districts were already tracking those, like the GPA, the test scores, the attendance, et cetera. And then we talked about just aggregating those measures at the setting level. But what we found was they found holes in the way that they were keeping the data. So attendance and discipline, for example, were being kept in different ways across the different schools in particular sites. And so how disciplinary infraction in one school was recorded was very different from another. And so I think, but without an intentional focus on trying to keep track of it at a system level, I don't think they would have arrived at that conclusion. They didn't like the result, right, like you said. And so I think how they reacted to it is a really good point, because whether or not they actually had the resources to do so, I think would obviously influence it too.
But I was thinking more about the indicators that were measures, not of aggregates of kids, but of the opportunities that the system. So are they offering AP courses? What's the college climate? Is there systems to provide knowledge?
Right.
Information about college access and things like that. So did they actually measure those? And if they found out they weren't doing them well, what did they do?
I think they attended to them. Like the AP, for example, in San Jose, and even in Dallas as well. I don't know if they necessarily had a good solution to them. I think they were tracking them, and it came to their attention. But I think in the 3 years span, I think we would need to have observed later on how they actually sort of corrected those. Because at least in Dallas, for example, they found they were tracking AP participation at the school level, and then they found that a lot of kids were taking AP classes but not taking the exams. So they passed an initiative where they raised money to then pay for all of the students' AP exam fees. So that was one way that they were trying to address the sort of equity issue around making sure that all kids, especially those who don't normally take the AP courses, have that opportunity as well. So I think that's one example, but you're right, I think we would need to have observed for longer in order to see how is it that they then reacted to it, and then what happened afterwards.
I can give you one other example. So I was there for the first 2 years of the project, and so it was a lot of sort of what indicators you're collecting, and a lot of the sort of cycle of inquiry, the number of times that districts are collecting data and then realizing there's literally not one person responsible for actually doing anything with the resulting data. And so in Pittsburgh, they had this issue where there were lots of connections to outside of school kinds of programs coming into the schools, and then no organization around it.
Right.
So they then required every organization in that way, whatever it is, to register with the centralized district, the central office, and then they were in process, and I don't know whatever happened to it, of saying, we are now going to take this sort of centralized information at the district office and say, what does allocation look like at all these different schools? Is it school A that's getting all these resources because the principal just knows how to sort of make
Right.
connections?
Exactly.
And is school B not getting anything? If that's the case, then we're going to push these districts to say, if you want to come into this school, you also have to go to these schools as well. We need sort of a wider range of effort from you. But I don't know where.
Yeah, but then I think also Pittsburgh did they did principal leadership initiatives where they would get the principals to come together to share resources and learn from one another, to have a professional learning community. So I think all of those issues also would come up in that kind of forum. So, yeah.
My head wanted to explode when you said, well, we got all this data in an enormous Excel spreadsheet, but we had no idea how to do anything with it. Are you leveraging the tools from Gapminder software by Hans Rosling, if you look at the TED Talk, the Khan Academy and Khan in the Classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different systems that that we can use to sort of have to help teachers to be able to look at data as well.
To have the actual individual
Right.
They need the school system and to keep them being promoted
Right.
on a grade system just because they have to move along the assembly belt instead of getting the help they need when they need it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the teachers that we talked to were not necessarily afraid of data. They wanted data to actually inform their practice, but they often didn't have the time, to actually sit down and download the sheet and come together as a group to talk about data. And or other types of platforms. So I think it's not necessarily they didn't know what to do with it. There was mountains of data, right? There's all sorts of data. But how it was organized, or if they actually had the structured opportunity to come together, I think was really sort of the key. And that time being protected and by the leaders within the school and the district supporting that kind of culture or that practice was also really important.
Can you talk a little bit about the academic tenacity?
Yeah.
You said, is it
Most elusive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what did you find that were district collected that fit under that umbrella? Did it matter? How did it relate to other things?
Again, I think you can add to that. I think that what I found in the sites that I was assigned to, which was Dallas and Pittsburgh, they all knew that academic tenacity mattered, right? This sort of self-discipline, self-efficacy, mastery orientation, right? But they didn't know how to measure it. And so we talked a lot about how there's surveys and school surveys, and they were doing a lot of it already, but then they didn't know what to do with that information. So what happens when a kid does report that they don't have the opportunities to meaningfully participate, or they, maybe somebody low on a mastery orientation measure, how they actually acted on that data was really tough for them. And the measurement issue was a big one. So they often use proxies, like attendance, as a measure of tenacity, which again is imperfect, right, at the individual level. But they were already keeping track of it. And so oftentimes one indicator at the individual level can serve for two different domains. But tenacity, I think, is one of those areas that everybody can, because grit is big, right? We hear a lot about grit. But I think they're sort of still emerging in their capacity to be able to track it and then use that information to change practices within their classrooms. So, yeah. Anything to add on tenacity? I mean, I know that was a big...
Yeah, I think, I guess two things. So one, just being that I think we felt like we had a responsibility to provide a larger framework. I mean, I wasn't instrumental in designing the framework, but I think just the idea that you want to think about these different domains, and I don't think all the districts were necessarily ready or even interested, depending on kind of going to that point. I mean,
right.
I think some thought about it more in the context of surveys and getting an idea of what students were thinking at sort of aggregate level, but not necessarily knowing how I take Manuelito and change sort of how he feels about a particular thing. I think that was the direction I saw a little bit more in Dallas. I think in Pittsburgh there were some ideas about
They use homework completion, too, as a proxy.
We supported them in things that they thought seemed,
good,
and interesting.
Yeah.
I think there were also some ideas about, this is not quite academic tenacity, but looking at sort of disengagement and things like that. And
Like disciplinary referrals. Yeah.
and mental health and other
Right.
kinds of things, but they're just trying to look at sort of where a
Right.
student's disposition was. And there were actually a lot of complications in terms of their staff who worked more closely
Right.
with kids didn't actually want to share that data because they felt like it was private and confidential. And so there was sort of these parallels.
There's tensions,
that,
yeah.
Again, don't know how it was resolved, where they started working with
They weren't.
individual kids and thinking about sort of their tenacity and their connection, their connectedness and things like that. But they didn't want to share the information back with teachers, and so it sort of was in this gray space that I don't know where it ended.
But I think but attending to it sort of helped them to understand that also school climate matters. And so I think they had, because they were sort of part of this initiative and thinking about things and like this is a dimension, academic tenacity being a dimension, that they thought about, well, what is the sort of conditions that we create in our classrooms and schools that can help kids feel more tenacious? Hi, Prudence.
So, thank
So these sites were selected in many ways by the foundation, or identified by the foundation, because they already had early warning systems already in place, and they were tracking those kinds of indicators. So they had a data infrastructure, supposedly, right? They had warehouse and longitudinal data systems. So I think they all differed in very unique ways. San Jose, I thought, was a really unique example where they thought about college readiness at another 3-level, at the elementary and middle and high school. So what does college readiness look like at the elementary level? And so what they did was they piloted, and they chose 3 schools, and 1 elementary, 1 middle, and 1 high, to think about these dimensions and these levels within these different settings. So I thought that that was a really unique way by which they took this framework and kind of ran with it. Other sort of, Pittsburgh had the Pittsburgh Promise, which provided financial aid and opportunities for the kids who were residents of Pittsburgh to then go to the state schools. And the district worked somewhat closely with the Pittsburgh Promise, and you would think that by having this Pittsburgh Promise opportunity in that district, that college readiness would actually be a big focus. But we were surprised that it wasn't more of a big focus, and there were issues around cut points. So Pittsburgh Promise was saying like a 2.75 was a college-ready GPA, but the district was saying that that was too low. And then, so I think they had to resolve those issues as well. So I think they sort of took this framework. They sort of took the understanding that we also need to keep track of college knowledge and FAFSA completion, for example, and Tenacity. I think they all went with that. They understood that they needed to have an expanded notion of college readiness. How they implemented it using the cycle of inquiry was really influenced by a lot of different factors that were happening that were unique in each settings. But because I think, for example, in Dallas with the executive, they had the executive directors of those strategic feeder patterns. They already had a structure and an opportunity to come together between elementary, middle, and high school grades to talk amongst themselves around data. But that system didn't necessarily exist in other places. New Visions is a whole other model, right? It's an intermediate organization, and their job is to look at the data and to be the data interpreters in many ways to then facilitate change in instruction and practices at the school. So I think, again, they adopted the model. They adopted this notion that we need to look more than just preparedness and look at college knowledge and tenacity, but how it was implemented was really quite diverse. But we found that those elements, the leadership, the data infrastructure, the adult capacity, were consistent throughout. Yeah. Hi.
I have a question. So for those schools, whether they are able to interpret their data or not, or you are able to sort of help facilitate, sort of the examination of the data, what were some of the change structures that they discussed possibly implementing based upon the data? I mean, the data tells you don't have enough information about, college knowledge. What did they do?
Well, I mean, I think first it raised awareness about the gaps, right? And then I think that raised discussions and opportunities for partnerships with other organizations within their communities that are already doing this work. And some weren't even aware that there was already somebody in their school actually doing this work. So I think by having this sort of opportunity to come together through these CRIS teams to talk about, okay, what do we know about our students, the extent to which our students understand the college-going process, to even just have that opportunity to actually discuss, then it gave them the, the wherewithal to understand that maybe there is a gap in our students' knowledge. And then, well, how can we fill that gap? Well, what's around us in their community? So I think that by just having that opportunity, it gave them, it gave them some more motivation to kind of address those issues. Ben. Career. Yeah.
Where does thinking about like this, does this imply that all students should go to college, or is it more that they should all be ready to if they so choose? And so where does thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'll speak for myself, but I think when we talk about the sort of skills and aptitude and attributes necessary to succeed in college, we feel that those are the very similar things that you would need to succeed in a career as well. Whether or not we have everybody should go to college kind of stance, I don't think so. I think what a lot of the districts that we worked in, particularly in Dallas, is that they were getting pushback from their communities, actually. Dallas, the folks that we were talking with in Dallas were saying that it was all about college readiness in Dallas, and that they weren't having enough conversations about career readiness and vocational education, et cetera, because it was kind of like a bad word. But they sort of understood that they needed to prepare for they needed to prepare the students to a level by which they could then go to college if they wanted to, but then have the skills necessary to maybe for them to do both. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering, like, what if there would be different aspects of the framework that would be more particular to career readiness perspective. I guess if you guys thought about that, but maybe that's
Yeah, we just focus on college. I think, yeah, it's an important issue, but I would imagine that those things like the tenacity, for example, or the behaviors would be the same in the preparedness. College knowledge obviously would be slightly different, but maybe it's around career awareness skills. I'm not really sure. I would have to think more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Pittsburgh, they sought and they only have high school approaches. And so I think this sort of menu of indicators in the system was really just meant to be sort of like an umbrella, omnibus approach to it. But then
Right.
coding skills and saw a little bit more embedded within schools that were doing that kind of work. They didn't really see a place for it within this sort of system.
System, yeah.
And just to kind of add on that, I think a lot of talk around career readiness is through the community colleges.
Right.
So high school students, part of being career ready is to be college ready, to go to a community college and get maybe a vocational certificate, CT, career tech, education type of certificate. So in order to be career ready, you also need to be
College.
college ready. Going up, more community college, where academic tenacity and all those factors are still going to come into play to earn a vocational, a career ready type of
Certificate. Yeah.
I have a question concerning, well, this population, we're looking at students of color, immigrant families, and low-income students. I'm wondering, is there any kind of data that looks at the demographics of the educators, and would you consider measuring the level of cultural competence important in this type of data?
That's a really good question. We didn't look at sort of cultural competencies of the teachers, right? But I think that is a really important issue. I think given the three levels, at the system and at the setting levels, I think there's an opportunity there to track those things. Can you say a little bit more about, are you thinking about practices within the classroom that are sort of make sure are respectful and taking into account students' cultures and yeah.
Sure, I'm mostly thinking of, the value of, if I'm an educator and I'm also from an immigrant family, low-income student, and being able to go back into the community, that's a different type of relationship I then have with my students. So I'm wondering if that plays a role in terms of looking at the demographics of the educators who are going into these really special communities.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, in some of the sites that we saw, a lot of the students, for example, a lot of the organizations that would come into these schools, they were also from the community, that they are now part of these community-based organizations that are helping out. So Boys and Girls Club, for example, or United Way. A lot of those folks came from the community, so they look like the students that are actually going to these schools. So I think that was a helpful, I think that helps for many students as well. So I think cultural competency, both within the classroom and actually beyond, I think is an important point. But it's not something that we necessarily tracked or that it sort of falls under. But I think because we talk about the system and the setting, there's an opportunity to attend to it. Yeah.
from, okay, we need to have our teachers stress college more, or is it the fact that we have no students of color role models in our schools, or role models for our students of color?
Yeah.
So did you see, because I could see how this kind of stuff could lead you to the same kind of solutions and not like really maybe getting at more important aspects that are leading, especially to the tenacity aspect.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think like similar to my response to Sean is that the 3 years wasn't really enough for us to sort of track those responses to the problems that raised by these data. But I think by just explicitly and intentionally tracking, for example, students' participation or exposure to AP or IB level courses, that some schools found that there were disparities among different racial ethnic groups, right? That some Latino students were disproportionately not exposed in particular schools to advanced level courses. How they then ameliorated that problem, I think we didn't really have a chance to sort of observe because their superintendents changed and budget cuts and things like this. But I think it raises an important point. But I think what CRIS does is it's an intentional frame, right? It's sort of, okay, if you really are serious about college students, increasing students' readiness for college, you have to think about it beyond the student. You have to think about the practices that are happening within the classroom, the exposure, the conditions by which you're sort of promoting these kinds of cultures and interventions, right? Because without developing the capacity of the adults to actually act on the data and to change those practices, then I think those disparities will continue and remain. Thank you for sitting with me in a very nice evening and a very sunny day. And I feel like really privileged to be the last of this series. So. All right. Thank you.